Right? It's like an ideas exchange. So we don't have. Welcome, Amanda. Thank you for coming down and speaking to us. No, it's very and Amanda's associate professor on the read that, so it meant something about the bodies. So this is for my website, but I will hate it for everybody's hearing pleasure. So at the University of Maryland, and research is at the intersection of health and humanities, UCLIC, and a lot of work, a lot of stellar work on HCI and aging perspectives. So I think it's going to be a real treat to hear from you. And I hand you the floor.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for having me. Thanks for meeting with me, for giving me food, sitting in the park with me. Yes, sustenance and lots of delicious drinks as well. So far. Yes, thank you all for coming. This is, I don't know, this is kind of a self-indulgent talk, I guess. This has been about thinking about HCI research on aging and the directions it's been going in my own personal place within it. So I have been really drawn to the places in research where we have kind of practice-oriented approaches on the one hand. So for example, healthcare practitioners trying to take care of people with menopause. And then on the other hand, you have these critical perspectives. So in the case of menopause, right, this is about gender in healthcare, the history of women's health, for example, in the US, it happened in a very particular way, led to a lot of distrust. But I don't find it so easy to be able to just kind of trade one for the other. Instead, I've been really interested in the places where they sit together. So my background, I come from a more practice-oriented perspective. So undergrad, I was an engineer. Then I did biomedical and health informatics for grad school, and I was doing things like technology deployments, you know, administering scales to kind of measure how it affected people's quality of life or mood. I studied the lived experiences of people with different kinds of health conditions, and I've been interested in looking at practitioners as well, working with populations with health conditions. But at this time, I also started to get really into critical perspectives. So I read feminist HCI and social justice-oriented design, and got really, really interested in kind of critical perspectives coming from gerontology. So I went down many different rabbit holes that have to do with, for example, what makes a person and how does dementia affect our understanding of that. So since then, really, I've continued to be consumed with these places where these are coming together. And I think no matter what, or many of the different fields that we are in, right, are experiencing this. You could see this with, I think, sustainability, fields I'm less familiar with, but also the ones I'm more familiar with. Health, which I mentioned already, disability, right? These kind of activist advocate perspectives coming up against people building and evaluating systems. And then the fields I'm particularly interested in as well, right? Aging and dementia is where I'm seeing these happening in our field. So today I'm going to talk about 3 projects that kind of sit with that tension between this kind of practice-based and critical perspectives that also kind of take you through my journey in this work. So the first one is in the domain of robotics for aging. This is a growing industry. There's many kind of national initiatives that have popped up, often framing the issue as one lack of caregivers, growing population, robots can fill that gap, right? And the media has really been captivated by robots for aging as well. In one study we looked at the way that the discourse around healthcare robots was kind of appearing on through study of videos on YouTube. So what we found is that these videos, it was often reassuring people, don't worry, robots are not going to replace care for you. But then in the case of older patients, robots were presented as almost having this magical ability to take care of people. So solving an issue for one group, but don't worry, not for another. So there's something going on with robots for aging, where it's being seen in certain kind of ways, framed in certain kind of ways, often very positive, right? But then at the same time, there's a lot of research on older adults rejecting robots. So talking about things like kind of demographic differences in why this might appear. Tasks, you might want a robot for one thing, but not for more intimate care, for example. Maybe it has to do with exposure and time spent with robots. And then what I became really interested in was this research which would basically follow around user-centered designers who were working with older adults to design robots based on user-centered design, but then finding that these user-centered designers, despite their best training, could not listen to the older adults' ideas. Like, it would not make it into the design process. Instead, they would talk to caregivers who sometimes would direct them back to the older adult. But it just became really hard to kind of follow the practice they were supposed to, right? And some of this is because they talk about how stigma about aging, ideas about aging, just can't or have such a presence that it becomes, it kind of takes over. So in this study, we were asking, how do older adults envision the role of robots in their lives? And then how do their preferences differ from assumptions made by robot designers? So we did 8 focus groups with 41 participants. We gave them examples of robotic pets, and then we had them also draw, kind of to extend their imagination. And then I'm going to talk about my findings in terms of how applying a critical lens kind of sheds light on this area and helps us understand our data as well. So this is in terms of 3 ways, so how robots are often designed, the kind of assumptions they are informed by older adults, and what people actually wanted. So first, robots are often designed to provide companionship for older adults. And we can see this as really being informed by ideas of older adults as socially isolated. So they don't have a social partner willing to hang out with them. So we can give them this technology that'll provide that social interaction we need. But we found that people actually were interested in having robots to augment their interactions with others. So people spoke about looking out the window at people walking dogs, but they weren't allowed to have dogs where they lived. So they could imagine using a robotic pet to start a conversation with that neighbor, or to have at a party, or even to have a conversation with someone they knew very well, like a spouse. Another way that robots are often designed and spoken about in the literature is to provide care for older people, right? These are the things that are going to take care of them. We could see this assumption as putting older adults in the kind of category of needing to receive care. But people actually spoke about how, the people who were interested in these robotic pets as companions spoke about how that's not actually how our relationships work, right? We develop relationships through receiving care, but also giving care. And they talked about thinking of how they might, how something like replacing batteries, right? Those kind of like routine, mundane things could potentially lead to that interaction. The last one I'll talk about is how robots are often designed with concerns around tricking. So this, I got to go kind of into that literature from philosophers thinking about robots for older people and what some of the ethical issues involved. And often this does come around deceit. So for example, one author writing, is it ethically justifiable to aim to create robots that people bond with? Example, in the case of elderly people or people with special needs. So here we're not even talking about people with cognitive impairment, right? We're kind of bracketing elderly people, this group. We have to worry about giving them this thing that they might form a connection with, but was never real in the first place. Here, what's the assumption that this might be informed by? Of older adults not really able to make these sound decisions when it comes to technology. But the way people actually spoke about this was more as something that they could decide to give in or not. So some people said, this is silly, I would never want to form a relationship with this. But others spoke about, made it clear that they didn't exactly think of it as a pet, right? They're not being necessarily tricked by it, but they could decide to engage with it anyways. So one person had stuffed animals, right? Many people in this room may have stuffed animals, and you have them, they're soft, and that you create some kind of relationship with them, but you don't think they're a real animal. Other people talked about having formed relationships with like the Star Trek characters on the screen, right? It's not, it's not a human relationship, but you can choose to give into that. So they're making the decision. So here, right, I think this critical lens is really useful to help us understand some of our data that would be challenging if we're not looking at the kind of societal framing of older adults that research shows us. We could trace the ways that values and narratives around aging become embedded in designs. It also may help us understand when rejection is occurring, right? When people are not choosing to adopt technologies that we think would be so useful to them, like robots have been a very popular area, and some more ways of understanding what's going wrong. Also, understanding the values that are at play can sometimes help us lead to new design directions, right? Thinking about maintenance, for example. reciprocal interactions, getting at technologies people might be more likely to use. So that's one place, right, where this critical lens can help us maybe understand our data better. But in other cases, it's not as easy to kind of unpack it in a critical light and then stop there. And that's the project I'm going to talk to you about next. So the study I'm talking about now is taking place within this kind of wider making, hacking, DIY movement, where the idea is that kind of anyone can make anything, right? It's spoken about as democratizing technology use for people with implications, possibilities for wide-ranging social good. So we're increasingly seeing makerspaces in places like schools and libraries and community settings. So bringing in the community so people can make. And in research, older adults are also being swept up into this vision of making for everyone. So some researchers are reframing narratives of making, saying, hey, we need to kind of change the way we talk about this because older adults are also already engaging in making and hacking. Others are designing technologies that can support older adults in making and hacking. And in one study, the researchers actually set up a makerspace in a community that provides, I've learned, I need to use different terms here because the ways we talk about the living situations is different, but it's a community that did support older adults with medical care and things like that. That community, they set up a makerspace within there and looked at the ways that older adults were using it. So in this project, we asked, how do older adults themselves make sense of these kind of making movements, and how would they drive the making initiatives that involve them? So this study took place in a independent living community, so a housing space that involved older adults. And continuing care means that it provides both kind of independent living, so people don't need assistance, all the way into sites where there's a lot more assistance. And the makerspace here came about because one of the residents, they had extra money that they had to use for tax purposes within the year. There was a room that was kind of up for grabs at that time. So similar to academia, I think we can identify this, right? So she had an idea to create a makerspace and use that money, get that room. That was originally a business center. A committee was assembled by this older adult living in this retirement community to be the makerspace planning committee. It involved individuals that had technical experience and also arts and crafts expertise. And they had a staff member who played a central role as well. So they met monthly and they made decisions around all the key aspects of the makerspace, from what equipment to purchase, to the name, to the paint color of the room, and everything like that. So we collected data for this study over 8 months, including observations, a focus group, interviews with individuals. We played kind of a more passive role overall, but as we also offered to be of assistance. So sometimes we played a more active role if they wanted us to tell them what we thought about something, like when we did the focus group. And the analysis we did presents ways that residents made sense of and formed opinions around this new technology space during its formation. And I'm going to talk about 2 of them. So the people we spoke to envisioned benefits for themselves from technology use in the makerspace, but even more than that, they spoke about others at the retirement community who were very disinterested in technology. And this could be an effort to get them more involved. They talked about people rolling their eyes when cell phone was pulled out of the dinner table, right? Or people being gifted tablets from adult children and kind of putting them away, locking them in a drawer. So the makerspace, these older residents thought, could maybe help other people learn how important technology is. And maybe they'd take their iPad back. They're hoping that sort of thing would happen. These eyes would be open to it. They talked about how these kinds of technology spaces could help other people be more in tune with the rest of the world, right? So the makerspace represented to them a way to combat this, what they perceived as this kind of like out of tune group of people who were out of tune with this like youthful technology world. But even as technology came up again and again as something that people need to be pushed towards, there was also recognition that this would kind of the technology looking space would be something that pushed people away. So they talked about needing to do things like have activities that use less technology to bring people into the space. So things like jewelry making or knitting or button maker. One strategy that was devised to kind of balance the advantages of newer technology with the ways to repel people was actually to purchase 2 machines. So they wanted to buy a self-threading machine, self-threading sewing machine to accommodate vision and motor impairments that many residents experience that made threading a needle really challenging, right? But all of the self-threading machines came with these more advanced settings, so like a digital display or something that you would have to tap into. So what they ended up doing is buying 2 machines, one that people who wanted to use, all the settings could use, and the other, which was the same, but they were able to put a piece of paper over that kind of digital display screen, saying leave the settings where they are, right? So taking this kind of more high-tech machine and almost artificially making it low-tech so that it could be more approachable to people, reducing the appearance of technological complexity. The second theme that I'll talk about is about judiciously determining resource allocation. So with all the kind of passionate efforts of the committee to draw people into the space, thinking about the technological kind of appearance and how activities to do, there was a lot of skepticism amongst residents, even people on the committee itself, who were supposed to be the strongest advocates. And a big part of this reaction can be understood as these people living in a space where they don't have that much control over the resource allocation. People brought up management expenditures in a path that they had seen as not making so much sense to them, like when an audio system that worked perfectly well was replaced. So even though residents were reassured that the cost of the makerspace were coming from a different source of money, that money had to be used, right? People weren't quite reassured. And part of this had to do with the appearance of the makerspace being one that was costly. So in a focus group, we showed them a video of a university makerspace, and the first kind of reaction after the video played was, that's a very expensive space, I would say. And people evaluated the cost of the makerspace, which seems like it cost more than it did as well, against other costs, like a bus that they thought that they were saying, we need a new bus for activities. That's where the money should go rather than the makerspace. So now I'd like to identify some of the points of tension between kind of more practice-based and a critical lens on the data. So from a critical lens, right, we know that makerspaces, while they are spoken about as including everyone, actually can be quite exclusive. Researchers have talked about how some groups have a lack of access to learning to work with certain materials that then become the dominant ones in the makerspace, or woodworking spaces, things like that, often studied in terms of gender. In terms of disability, people have looked at how the machines in makerspaces, while said to be for all, right, aren't actually very accessible for people with disabilities. And here too, right, we have found another dimension, which is the centrality of youthfulness. Makerspaces may be giving off this very youthful appearance, right? This video that looked normal to us, people talked about how, makerspaces might, young people might be attracted to these kinds of spaces because it's a lot of stuff and machinery. Or they even spoke about in terms of younger, older adults. They were trying to think of how to recruit more people to their living community. This will bring in the younger, older people because they're a little bit more affiliated with the world as it is now. People distance themselves from it, saying it might make more sense in a school setting, a library, but I don't know how useful it would be here. At the same time, this kind of attribute of youthfulness was actually the thing that drew others, right? So some people talked about how makerspace presented opportunities to stay connected with the world, to learn new things. So another kind of juxtaposition of the critical lens, where it can't cover all of our data, is in terms of the technology charisma of the space. So Ames talks about charismatic technologies as deriving power from the promise of what they will do, and how this can be deceptive. It can make adoption look straightforward, and it can obscure the choices and politics that are actually involved in kind of deploying widely deploying some technologies. And I would definitely argue that the makerspace is a charismatic technology or a charismatic technology environment. And this becomes even more apparent when we see the almost inverse disinterest the group of people we spoke to have for the makerspace. One person said that the makerspace is a way for young people to learn the skills that we would have done by hand. They just put it on the computer setting. So while she saw the benefits to learning basic technology first for her generation, she didn't see the utility for making technologies. She said she's already taken home economics. This is kind of an arts and crafts situation, but it's for younger people. So they just put it on the computer. And often we might frame these kinds of findings as technophobia, but there's all kinds of reasons for the disinterest that appear in our data that make sense for kind of the place in life people were. So one person said when they saw the 3D printer presentation, they said, what can we do with that? The answer is you can make all kinds of stuff. And one participant responded, well, I'm still getting rid of stuff. You know, they're kind of downsizing. They have a space. They can have that interest in making all those little things. So the findings indicate that while the makerspaces can represent opportunities for creativity and returning to skilled production for some, but this view isn't really timeless, right? This is tethered to a particular time in history and more likely to be salient to certain groups of people than others. But at the same time, I wouldn't say that that means that this club should not exist because it is, after all, a club like any other, right? We could also include, when we look at it, we could see it as a club like a Tai Chi or a religious organization or another kind of group that may not be something that everyone wants to do, but is certainly worth some people's time. So there's practice-oriented implications still we can get from this, right? For designing technologies for older people. For example, we can recognize there are on-ramps to bring older people into maker spaces using button makers or knitting less technological activities. And many of our findings also raise issues with the utopian vision of the maker spaces, right? That some researchers are pushing back on. Finding that, for example, this quality of youthfulness may be kind of seeping out of our machines and our spaces without us realizing and feeling it, therefore excluding some things. But the data also indicates that just a critical pushback can't account for all the positions in the data. There's places where there are not really simple answers, and there are these kind of messy realities that we can't so easily resolve. And that brings us to the third study. So here, this represents kind of a vein of work where I'm trying to understand how we could actually leverage the differences between these kinds of perspectives to advance our research. And here we did this through applying a diffractive reading approach to our data from a design workshops with older adults on the topic of IoT. So what is diffractive reading? It's an approach introduced by physicist feminist Karen Barad, and she draws together thought from feminist theorist Donna Haraway alongside physicist Neil Bohr's framework on quantum physics. So for me, this was quite exciting to see these brought together. And it represents an example of one way we can work within disciplines and sub-disciplines where there's conflicting approaches and perspectives, which for me is aging and technology research where I'm interested in. So this perspective is intended to yield understanding of how these different approaches within and across disciplines materialize in matter. And it comes with a particular orientation. So it's not about kind of taking down, rather it's a respectful engagement, attempting to carefully read the questions being asked and the arguments being made, while at the same time being attentive to their necessary presuppositions and limitations. So it's it involves kind of a critical lens, but in a very particular way. So to do a diffractive analysis, we had to do two things. First, we did 3 separate analyses of data from a single design workshop, and then we had to figure out how to do a diffractive reading of these 3 sets of analyses, because there are not, unfortunately, precise instructions. Well, people have done this with qualitative research. We're kind of inferring from some of the things Barad is saying. The design workshop, what was it? So it took place at an alumni event. It was titled Explore the Future of Smart Homes. And we had a bunch of different activities. So it looks like many design workshops you might have seen, right? First, we started with IoT toolkit cards, those cards that say, buzz, beep, input, output type things, to prototyping with an electronic toolkit, and then design materials like construction paper type things. 26 older participants engaged in this workshop, and we gathered data through cameras at the tables, audio recorders, notes by the researchers at the table, observations by visiting researchers, and researcher reflections after. So what did these 3 separate analyses of data look like? Or how did we do it? So a different researcher took the primary lead for each analysis. And though we, wrote this neat, tiny paper about it, we did have people. So the analysis we created were kind of true within their subdisciplines, right? Because researchers that worked within those subdisciplines within the HCI were all responsible for them, working with the literature that they were familiar with, working with the analytic method that they were familiar with doing to do their analysis. So in the first analysis, I'm not going to talk too much about this one, but we focused on content. They took an affinity diagramming method, and they really operated within the literature on IoT in general, not for older adults in particular, just thinking through the literature on IoT and where the contributions are here. The themes that they generated had to do with supporting awareness of and automating home tasks, connecting remotely, and they really focused on how the progression of our design activities led to these refined understandings over time. So participants' ideas increased in complexity over the course of this workshop, from micro to macro level contextually aware systems. At first, they were brainstorming systems that required action based on a small set of sensing systems. For example, to unlock their home based on when they arrived home. As they start to discuss their ideas together, their view of IoT complexity grew. They began to discuss automating tasks based on actions that were happening elsewhere in the home. For example, after hearing one person's idea of getting notified when the shower reached the right temperature, another person envisioned a connected coffee maker that would start brewing coffee as soon as they started showering. After these groups used electronic toolkit in the prototyping activities, their ideas expanded to these macro level contextually aware systems, requiring information from multiple sensors throughout space to provide actionable information that could assist with home maintenance and routine tasks. As one example, participants commiserated over the burden of putting up holiday lights every year only to remove them shortly after. And they prototyped this fairly complex system that could automate some of that work. So now I'm going to shift to the second analysis that we took with this data. So this one was really focusing, we came in with a focus on the target group. Again, did affinity diagramming to analyze the transcripts from each table. And in this research, the IoT, the past literature on IoT for aging, and what's been raised as kind of matters of interest there was the most salient. And here the themes that emerged were about the interest that participants had in reminders and in safety. So I'll talk about the second, right? Participants envisioned all kinds of different ideas that could support safety for older adults. Seasonal decorating emerged as a very risky task that spurred design at several tables. One participant revealed that they had left their holiday lights up for 3 consecutive years. Someone else was interested in the idea because his grandson, who usually helped him decorate, wasn't coming this year for Christmas. So the final design was a bookcase housing a fully decorated Christmas tree on a Roomba-style robot that rolled outside. It turned on automatically when it got dark, and it had light sets for multiple holidays. Another person, based on his experience with seasonal decorations, was motivated to create a design which was a remote communication device similar to a life alert, a fall pendant, that could notify loved ones if his wife fell and hurt herself in their home. His motivation in the design was because of his past experience falling over 7.5 meters while hanging Christmas lights. So together, the anecdotes shared by participants, the resulting systems that they designed, indicate an opportunity for researchers to look into automating or assisting these seemingly mundane household tasks, which can end up being quite dangerous or difficult for older adults. Our third analysis takes a critical process-oriented focus to analyze the dynamics of older adults' engagement in an IoT workshop. So the kind of sub-community we're operating within here is a critical aging perspective, like papers that note how older adults are often framed in terms of decline, or attend to the resistance towards technologies that are designed for them, towards them. So here, the data that became important was also the transcripts, but also observations of the researchers and also the videos, because we became focused on the ways that participants were reacting to the design activities. And as our analysis progressed, we began to focus on the ways participants were responding to prompts and directives, and we really found these mismatches between researchers and attendee expectations. Participants were subverting what it meant to be a good participant in a user-centered design study in two ways, by going through the motions and by having a good time. So one way that they resisted what it means to be a good research participant was going through the research activity without contributing any real opinions or thoughts. During the post-session debrief, one undergraduate researcher at one table described how some of the participation during this IoT toolkit card activity were, participants were supposed to kind of align that to form ideas, right? But instead, people's participation was more like, I'm just going to throw this down here. I don't know what they are, right? So just kind of like, let's just use up these cards. Another way participants resisted the role of a good participant was doing the bare minimum needed for an activity. And they often found shortcuts to get the work that we asked them to do done. One table decided to do an activity as a group because that'll make it easier. One participant got an undergraduate student to do the work of cutting out a bush for a Christmas tree light system by asking them, if you were me, how would you make a green bush? And as the student responded, starting to cut it out, they said, you're doing a good job, you know? Like, why don't you keep doing that? So in this mode of participation, the measure of whether an activity was done was whether the individuals had done enough to satisfy the researchers, to make us happy, not whether they were actually expressing something that reflected their actual preferences. So now that we have our three separate analyses, we can do our diffractive reading. So diffractive approaches study differences, right? So if you have the physics, if you remember those gold experiments, right? The goal here is to study differences, how the different differences get made, what gets excluded, and how the exclusions matter. So what we did, we looked through the other papers who had taken diffractive analysis in other fields, and we went back to the original Karen Broad. And what we figured out to do is to iteratively revisit our three analyses to find distinctions and boundaries. So this could be places where the same data was appearing, but was talked about or picked up differently in different analyses, or places where data was picked up and spoken about in one analysis or another. And then we memoed while we read our findings through one another to see the details, the specificities of these relations of difference and how they matter. And diffractive reading is really interesting because you can use it to look back at your methods or to look at your findings. You can't use it for both at the same time. But I'm going to talk about some of the things we found by looking at our findings through a diffractive reading. But first, I want to pause and say that just taking these three separate analyses, right? Each of them, I think, do contribute to HCI in a small way. These were small analyses, but they are meaningful, right? So in the first one, we see people going from this micro level of thinking to macro level of thinking through engaging in these IoT design activities. That is useful for our design work. In our second analysis, we learned that, and in the first one, right, part of how this came about was through looking at this holiday decorating robot, which was like the pinnacle of their complex system design. In our second one, holiday decorations were ceilings as well, but they meant something different. This idea of a 25-foot fall of an older individual trying to hang these, of the grandson not coming home for Christmas that year, right? Of a house with lights left out 3 years in a row. Here, I think this is a meaningful area to kind of design around and automate these mundane tasks, but also these kind of seasonal tasks that we're not seeing accounted for in our literature design technologies. You can imagine a sensing system, for example. Could we figure out when decline is happening, not just from day-to-day activities, but for these things that have this kind of rhythm through the year? And in analysis 3, the significance of our holiday decorations happens in the way that participants found a way to put minimal effort into an activity by convincing a young research assistant to do that work of cutting out the construction paper for their final design, right? Yeah, and so again, so each of these I think have important implications. So carrying these analyses out within our existing subdisciplines and our traditions are useful. They teach us things. They are important. But reading one analysis through another can help us understand what's at stake in different interpretations. So hopefully we can make more informed decisions about which research path to pursue. So when we have insights from about holiday decorations related from analysis 2 about older adults needing support with these kind of activities, these additional activities that we can monitor and support them in. We read that through analysis 3, which talks about older adults kind of resisting through that lens. We can see that, well, maybe casting these activities as another dimension to monitor could be something that could end up with some resistance. So it's not to say that reading one insight through another should prevent researchers from moving forward in that space, but rather to see what might be coming, kind of possibilities down the line, some of the ethical or practical considerations that may impact us further, and that I don't think we can get from a single analysis or even triangulating our methods. A second example is that if analysis 1 was so under getting some design implication for kind of a general population, like we did through analysis 1, looking at design workshops. Well, when we loop that through analysis 2, those of you who've studied aging in the past, look at the reviewer comments you've gotten that say, when you try and make these general statements, right, based on your work on older adults, and they say, well, isn't that just about older adults? It makes us think about why our findings, how they may be able to be useful for the community outside of aging HCI researchers as well. And finally, if analysis 3, where we see participant resistance, is the only one that we reported from our data, you might come away with the idea that IoT design for aging is useless. People are not interested in these things. Why are we even doing this? But that's not true, right? We have real examples in the data, like the person worried about his wife thinking of this life alert pendant for her, given his experience with falls, that we can't just kind of wave away as well, right? So there are real needs for care we're seeing. So I do think that probing the places in our different analyses that don't sit so easily together can help our research stay closer to what is truthful and can better serve the populations that we study. So in terms of takeaways or what paths forward we might have here, I think collaborating with different perspectives is important. And we know, right, collaborating with other disciplines can get us a lot. But I really do think that collaborating within our subdisciplines, within our community, can bring us a lot as well. And here, this effort works because of our difference, our diversity, not in terms of discipline, right? We're all HCI researchers, but we approach our topics, aging and health, in very different ways. So working together as part of a research team was important, but also having the space to conduct our own rigorous in our own ways analysis, right? So we didn't do everything together. We went apart, did the best that we could within our subfields, and then came back together to see how these sat together or did sit together so well. Broad also has an interesting stuff about how to account for our positions. So in her view, a positionality statement does not do enough. It just describes you, but it doesn't say how that actually impacts the research you did. So these include some ways when you do a diffractive analysis, it includes some ways to account for your positions through the way the data itself takes shape as well. So potentially giving us more kind of rigorous ways to show, if that's your epistemology, right, how your experience with the world is actually affecting the way you work with your data, which you can't necessarily see just by working with your own data. You need different lenses as well. And finally, when do I think this approach is useful? So I think it's useful in 2 ways. So one is when you are doing an analysis and you're like, I've seen this data before, I've seen these findings before. So well-trod paths, I think, are where this can be particularly exciting. And the other space, I think, is these contentious areas where you are seeing 2 points of view coming up in our field, kind of not sitting so easily together. I'm hoping that this could help us find some ways around it. So with that, thank you so much for listening. And yeah, I'm happy to take any questions.
Right, sure. Obvious question is about resources on property development, right? Like, can we rely on having 3 times as many sort of time person to do that? And how would you justify that being going, say, we're running up the road?
So you're saying for the third project where it's like,
Yes.
that's why I don't think we need to do this with everything. Like, I don't think, that's what I'm saying, each individual analysis is valuable still, right? So it's not like, hey, everyone, we have to stop doing single analysis. But I do think here, like, when we first saw the data, some of us, like me, I was like, wow, that didn't work. No one wanted to participate. And other people were like, okay, we could write about, medication reminders is something that came out of this. We kind of know this in our field, but like, we can still write about this, right? Because we were coming from a different time. So I'd say, I think in certain situations, this could be useful to get new understandings. I don't think this is something we need to do for everything.
Do you think it's a sort of a learning process, or like, do you think that having done that in your next projects, you will be more sensitive to things you might be missing?
Yeah, I think I would have new ways of looking at some of the data that I would be getting, or new ways of holding. So I think I wouldn't come in as quickly and say, hey, we didn't learn anything, everyone hated it, right? I think I'd be a little more attentive to the cases where things were going well. So I do think it gave me a new sensitivity, but I do think it's also, you do end up finding very specific things that are specific to the context, for example, of like IoT here, aging.
Thanks so much for the presentation. I also have a question regarding the case study. So I just wonder whether you could tell us a little bit more about the professional backgrounds of the researchers that have conducted the analysis, and whether their backgrounds in terms of the literature that they engaged with also informed the way they analyze the data.
Yeah.
A follow-up question. Given that the researchers also collected the data analysis separately, do you think that a collaborative approach may also lead to potential differences, similarities between findings?
Yeah, that's a good question. So for your first question, definitely part of the like package on this was, we had different ways of analysis we were comfortable with. I mean, these two researchers had worked, were kind of more similar to each other. So both of them did affinity diagramming often, right? Where you're clustering things. One was kind of a more senior professor. So her experience was IoT more broadly. She worked with IoT with all different populations. So she was the one who looked more at, oh, hey, this is how people are working in the workshops, getting from these different micro to macro contextually systems. And then one was at the time PhD student who was working in IoT for aging. Like his dissertation was designing toolkits for older adults to engage in making activities, right? He's one who found the safety reminders things. And then I would have been, like I said, interested in these kind of critical perspectives. And I often do, my approach is more like constructive experiment theory. So I took that one. So definitely the literature we read and is part of how I think we like find our questions or our interests too, right? And so coming to that's, yeah, what we're sensitive to, because in qualitative analysis, right, you decide what quotes to take and to code. So both deciding what is salient to you, and then what you're coding. So part of this was more of a natural process, and then we thought about, okay, what people did the analysis, okay, what literature is informing you, what are your backgrounds? We actually, all three of us had kind of more technical backgrounds, so it was almost, it did end up more like our own interests took us over our careers to different places, I'd say, than social scientists and the anthropologists and the engineers and that. And then in terms of the second question, would collaborating get us this? So that's why I don't think it would. So that's why I think the thing that studies differences, like going through the whole thing and then looking at the differences of the waves originally, would matter, right? Because then you can see what's there in some, what's not there in other. Because otherwise, you got to capture that quote, which you got to make a decision about where the quote ends and which one to do together. And I think you'll find interesting things in that approach as well. Collaborating is amazing, but this is a different thing.
Thank you.
I have a question about the naming spaces that you were talking about. but for older adults. So these were maker spaces like existing type of maker spaces that you'd see at universities and stuff like that. You trying to introduce older adults into. That was my understanding.
So this was actually older adults decided amongst themselves to create a makerspace.
Okay.
Yeah, and they involved staff as well, so it had to be kind of like a collaborative approach there. And they invited us to study that effort. Yeah.
Okay, because I know that work by like Capel, I might say first, and Calvin, they were looking at existing maker spaces for older adults, like knitting groups and stuff like that, and looking at how they could introduce technology into those existing ones to, like, you know, improve, well, not improve, but just change the way that they currently do their maker.
Yeah.
Work. So I was just wondering your comments on that.
Yeah, it's been really interesting. I really think that HCI has gone to, there's a real nice like body of work in this space of people looking at making maker spaces for older adults. I think partially because it's so easy to draw that parallel to these, like, you know, embodied or knowledge that older people have that maybe younger generations haven't learned as well, working with materials and things like that. Yeah, so I think that work is really interesting. And I think what our study let us see is, since we were the ones kind of bringing the technology, we almost got to see some of the kind of resistance and back conversations that were happening. We got to speak to people who didn't know about the makerspace, right? Or had heard of it, but weren't so involved. And we got to kind of so we got to take these different positions because we were the ones kind of bringing it in, I think. And instead we had people on the inside letting us in and getting us people to talk to. So I think in that case, we were able to find some ways of resistance, some reasons people weren't interested. And that's on the one hand, and on the other hand, understand what is involved when older adults themselves are leading these efforts, right? What are the decisions that they're making when they're in charge of like the resource allocation? Because you can imagine both I think are important for researchers to understand. Yeah, especially if we see these maker spaces as like an extension of the business center, the computer lab, which is what many places have.
Just following up on that makerspace, like, what were the sort of cultural or contextual adjustments that we have to make when we are deploying, let's say, our version or our understanding of a makerspace in a community that doesn't understand makerspace the same way? So, for example, in the photograph of the brainstorming, there was at the end facts compatible, which perhaps in our generations, not the thing that we consider, they were considered. So, what were those contextual adjustments that we have to make?
Great question. So this was really interesting. Okay, so I have so many thoughts. So first of all, we drew from Kruchi and Toyama, who were the ones who did put the makerspace into community. So they looked at their recommendations, like the person found them and asked what machines they had used. So and brought those in. And then there was a lot of kind of scaffolding work, bringing in people from a local library to talk about 3D printers, the experts, right? Okay, we have these machines that have been brought into settings with other older adults. Now, how do we support and scaffold the use? And the contextualizing thing, that to me is a really interesting thing to think about, because on the one hand, you could say, well, let's get machines that they're interested in and want to use. But on the other hand, part of the excitement around it was that it's this existing movement that people are a part of, that these machines, right? The 3D printers, the thing people think of when they think of a makerspace. And I think the 3D printer has been the most problematic technology in that space. We've continued to kind of follow them and work with them. And that one's really hard. But at the same time, if they just had, you know, the tools that other kinds of tools, would that be a makerspace where they can? So yeah, I'm very interested in like the glow that the makerspace label has, and how in some cases you realize it's less glowy, but that glow is kind of useful too, to get some people interested. Yeah, but I think their jewelry classes are the most popular. Yeah, I don't know. It's
I think I'm at this around for this evening. So we will be going out for drinks, and importantly, to celebrate Ilani's bio. Giving you the heads up. So we'll be celebrating that as well. So 5 o'clock, I think we'll head out to Berkeley because I think it's nice to sort of unless somebody has a better idea. And then a few of us will have dinner, so please let me know if you'd like to join so that I can. And thank you so much, Amanda, for that great talk. And if anybody wants to speak to Amanda, she's still around.